Y'all, it's it's getting a little hot in here. Did someone futz with the thermostat? So, something that kept me in Christianity for a long time was an honest fear of hell. And I know a lot of people who are ex Christians or even current Christians that have this fear. Honestly, I find that it's something that hangs over a lot of people's heads. And it's likely the reason why Christianity has stuck around so long. Turns out that if you tell children that there's an unimaginable, everlasting torture waiting for them after they're dead if they change their mind, as an adult, they hesitate on changing their mind. Leave a comment, by the way, if you felt this before leaving Christianity. I'm interested in your stories. I I remember quite clearly the point that I left Christianity. I took a long walk in the middle of the night down a city sidewalk. And a lot of events had led me there that I may go into later. But the main thing that had put me there on that night was the idea of salvation. It had clicked for me a few weeks prior that God's method of salvation was quite cumbersome. So God creates humanity. He puts a tree in the garden, and humanity has no concept of sin and doesn't know what the difference is between good and evil, and yet are punished for disobeying God, which is apparently what evil is. And strangely enough, the tree of knowledge is the forbidden one, suggesting that seeking knowledge is a sin. But that's all a tangent. The weird part of that whole exchange is the idea that God created a perfect world, and yet somehow sin breaks out into that world because of Eve's action as a free agent, in a world that God created from scratch, knowing the future, which is still even further strange. Or, if you hold a more metaphorical image of the creation story, Adam and Eve never existed, nor did the Garden of Eden, or the Tree of Life, or the Tree of Knowledge, and yet sin somehow still breaks out into a perfect world that a perfect God created. And I guess we blame Satan, or whatever it is that you want for that, but you still result in this weird understanding of original sin that doesn't have a whole lot of precedent. But for whatever reason, we still need to atone for, because there's this arbitrary idea that we fall short of perfection, whatever that is. And this means we need Jesus. It's not the most intuitive thing, but this is a taste of trying to make sense of the foundation of the reason for needing salvation in the first place. Trying to justify why we're held responsible for Eve's actions, how Adam and Eve were held responsible for something they were completely unaware of, or why understanding the difference between good and evil is something worthy of punishment, or how sin affects us living today, or why we seem to have trouble figuring out the difference between good and evil when we try and articulate exactly what we mean by it, even though having this understanding is what we're being punished for. Churches often didn't like wide-eyed, curious Christian Ocean asking these questions, so I had to figure out a lot of them for myself. And all of these questions are ones that I found Christianity just inadequate at answering. I noticed that many of them stemmed from these base ideas in that story in the garden. You knock that out, and suddenly the whole conversation seems a little absurd. But even taking into consideration that somehow all of this happened, that something happened that makes sin a thing that we have to grapple with, and that even being tainted with it a little bit puts us into this position of needing eternal damnation, the solution seems equally absurd. So, Christianity puts us into a position of being guaranteed hell, even if we have a moment of dishonesty in our minds, or if we disobey commands from God that we may or may not be aware of, and that furthermore, it seems to render any thoughts of sexuality as sinful. But in order to deal with this, we have to become aware of a particular figure in history and believe that his execution was actually self-sacrifice and fulfillment of prophecies. This particular figure that never wrote anything, and everything we have about his life is secondhand, and in addition to a ton of writings about him that we're supposed to ignore, and this is supposed to be sufficient. Furthermore, belief and acceptance of this particular historical fact, assuming it's truth, is what's supposed to be the thing that absolves us of this whole issue of sin, even though it doesn't really functionally change a whole lot about who we are. Maybe we act in accordance with his teachings afterwards, but we still get sexual urges. We still have angry thoughts. This doesn't really seem to have a whole lot to do with respect to absolving this issue, except that we're told that it does. Which, and I'm sorry to say this, but it seems like you're trying to sell me something that doesn't work. This perspective of taking a step back and just looking at the logistics of Christianity as an outsider was pretty useful to me on this long walk. My next step was trying to figure out why such a deity would be so logistically incompetent. You'd think that a perfect God with a perfect plan would have a better system in place, one that's far more intuitive and doesn't require all this setup. And furthermore, a seemingly consistent proclivity among his followers to disagree over the issue of salvation. Are we saved permanently once we are just saved once? Does it include if we leave the faith behind? Do we have to speak our sins, or do we just accept the sacrifice? If we leave later, were we ever saved at all? Christians seem to disagree massively on all of these factors. And there aren't clear answers to these questions, as evidenced by the wide variety of interpretations held by Christians, which forces me to hold that God is a bad communicator, which means he's not perfect. Because a perfect God would not be this bad at communication, which gets a little weirder when you manage to struggle past this and into a position of assuming heaven and hell are real. If heaven and hell are real, and it depends on the belief in Christ in order to get there, then we should expect visions of the Christian hell across civilizations when they describe the afterlife. But they don't. I mean, we can take the heathen legends as an example. There's a story of a man named Hadding who meets a woman bearing herbs out of season. He asks her where she got them, and she shows him. She takes him through dark clouds, down a winding road into a land lush with green, leading him to the walls of Helheim, the land of the dead. She finds a rooster and rings off his head, killing it. And then she throws the rooster over the walls of Helheim, and it's heard crowing on the other side, brought back to life. Another story is that of Thorstein, a man who is lost at sea and is later seen by a shepherd approaching a mountain declared sacred by Thorstein's father. The mountain opens up to reveal warm fires and sounds of celebration within, and the shepherd struggles to get closer so that he might hear the words that are being said, and sees Thorstein enter, hearing shouts of welcome to him by his ancestors, bidding him take the high seat by his father. I'll probably go into heathen concepts of the afterlife in more detail in a later video. It deserves more in-depth treatment considering the vast differences in the Christian and heathen concepts. But for now, we can observe that the stories regarding the afterlife are distinct from Christianity in that they don't describe hell. And this rings true across multiple civilizations, which leads us to conclude one of a few choices. One, that there is no afterlife whatsoever, and all of these visions do not reflect any kind of reality. And this is certainly a possibility, that instead of an afterlife, there's just nothing at all. It's certainly a coherent position, and there's justification for explaining these stories in that fashion. But let's assume for a second that there is an afterlife. Why are there so many different stories? And why do the non-Christian civilizations describe something other than hell? According to the Christian view, these stories should not exist, and the only way for them to be explained by the Christian is to be accused of falsehood, which would undermine their own ability to discuss the afterlife in the first place. If we can just dismiss other stories of the afterlife, what prevents us from dismissing the Christian stories of the afterlife? And if the Christian stories of the afterlife are to be considered true, then aren't we back in the same place of wondering why we don't find consistency elsewhere in other discussions of the afterlife? We should not have pleasant stories describing afterlives that are something other than what Christians describe. And any justification that the Christian gives to dismiss this can be turned right back onto themselves. So the hypothesis of what consequences we should expect to find among non-Christian civilizations if hell exists has been rendered false, which means that hell probably does not exist, causing dominoes to fall across the rest of Christian spirituality regarding sin, which renders Jesus' sacrifice irrelevant and unnecessary, which means that Christianity is essentially one option among many for people to follow, that, assuming the afterlife, the Christian heaven is but one afterlife among many. Though, to be honest, if the Christian heaven is that which is granted to people who do not go to hell, then it probably doesn't exist either. Though descriptions of hell aren't very common in the Bible, and it could be that the followers of Christ do have a heaven, just as others have a different afterlife. A coherent view of the afterlife would be that it's just one of many, rather than a single one or two of ultimate reward and punishment. Maybe there is one of punishment, but I don't know what it would look like, and I don't know what it would take to get there. but it's probably not based on something as ridiculous or as arbitrary as to whether or not you believe the right thing about a person who lived a couple of thousand years ago. If the afterlife doesn't exist, it affords some interesting prospects. Do we experience something in our brain as it's overloaded with chemicals? Do our beliefs affect that moment and how it plays out? Whatever the case, we're gone. There's a haunting concept that in not existing, we'll have to undergo some void of darkness and experience non-existence. But that shouldn't be the case. I have no experience what it was like before I was born. Death with no afterlife would likely be very much the same. So, upon examination, I've left hell behind. It took me a long time to do so, but the stories around the afterlife in pagan faiths have allowed me to do so. And the result for me is that, either the afterlife exists or it doesn't. And if it exists, I'll likely be pleasantly surprised. If not, well, I won't be upset. Mainly because I can't be. And with that, I'm Ocean Keltoi, and I want to know what you guys think about this. So for Christians, what are your thoughts on hell? And for ex-Christians, what role, if any, did hell play in leaving your faith or keeping you in? Also, do you guys believe in an afterlife? And if so, is it the Christian image or is it some other idea of it? Let me know in the comments down below, guys. And finally, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. I've recently been running around on Twitch in the middle of the night playing Ocarina of Time, which has been a lot of fun. It's been great interacting with you guys, so be sure to jump over there. I don't have a schedule or anything yet, so it's just kind of random, but thanks to everyone for watching, liking, and leaving a comment. And remember to find a way or make one.